Hey, Eli, how you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good. Your piece last month was fantastic, and I'm so thrilled to have you on about it. It was a really interesting story, really an election story, but also a kind of foreign policy story, and those two things don't usually necessarily go together in America. It's a piece about former Republican Senator Norm Coleman, one of the Republican Party's biggest fundraisers. Norm Coleman, for those who that name sounds familiar, that was the guy that Al Franken defeated. He was also the guy who won the election after Paul Wellstone died. Norm Coleman has been one of these villainous Republican figures for a very long time, and he's popped back up thanks to your reporting in exposing what he's doing. Norm Coleman now runs the Congressional Leadership Fund PAC, as well as the American Action Network, which is a tax-exempt dark money group. The Congressional Leadership Fund PAC is essentially the congressional Republican super PAC to support their elections. Now, Eli reported a piece that isn't so much about Coleman's influence as a fundraiser. It's more about his role as a lobbyist for the Saudi Arabian government, for the monarchy, the dictatorship over there. So I guess let's start at the beginning here, because there's so many overlapping things going on here. How did a former Republican United States senator become a lobbyist for the Saudi government?
Well, how exactly that happened is probably a fascinating story, and I'd love to hear Norm Coleman tell it. But Norm Coleman, and I think you kind of hit the highlights of his career in elected office. But before he was a senator, he was also a Democrat. So right. he went from being a Democrat to being a Republican to being a lobbyist for Saudi Arabia. He could wear a lot of hats.
That's quite a trajectory, right? Like to go from Democratic mayor of St. Paul to Republican U.S. senator to like literally lobbying for the Saudi monarchy.
Right. And, if there's something that sort of defined these other earlier hats he wore in his career, it's that he would kind of only wear one at a time. He would change. But, the guy was definitely flexible and fluid in his political identity and party affiliation. But at least he kind of did one at a time. And roughly in 2014 is when he signed up to become a lobbyist for Saudi Arabia. And already he was one of the Republican Party's biggest fundraisers. He was already affiliated with the Congressional Leadership Fund at that point. But in 2014 is when there's nothing all that unusual until then about a former United States senator, in this case a Republican, overseeing a major super PAC that would kind of follow. But in the case of Norm Coleman, in 2014, he decided, hey, I can actually do a few of these things at the same time. I can be one of the Republican Party's biggest fundraisers, especially in the era of Citizens United, where all of those limits on campaign donations and spending were largely lifted. And I can become a lobbyist for Saudi Arabia at the same time. And that's a pretty powerful role to be in, because in his capacity as a fundraiser, it's not just that he raises the money. He also is overseeing, or at least is involved with, the process of where this super PAC spends its money. And it has to make decisions, just like everyone does about with finite resources. And this place has a lot of resources, but it's still finite, about which members and which races are going to receive its support and which will not.
Okay, so let me stop you there, because one thing that went unmentioned so far is that. And we're not alleging this, to be clear, that this is happening directly. So I want to be very clear about this. But foreign governments are not allowed to spend in American elections. Like, that's just not allowed. Now, I know there's been a lot of talk about Russia and all the like, but point being that under our laws, a foreign government cannot spend in our election. However, Norm Coleman seems to have found some sort of gray area here where a guy who is lobbying for a foreign government can direct separately in a separate role, but the same guy who's lobbying for a foreign government can direct massive amounts of spending in an election that will determine the policies in part that affect that foreign government. I mean, is that basically what the gray area Norm Coleman has found and is living in?
Right. Well, I mean, again, I guess it's not a gray area because he is on probably the legal side of it. I would just add that it's not just foreign governments, it's foreign individuals. Individuals who are not U.S. citizens or U.S. permanent residents are not supposed to be involved in the U.S. election process either, specifically giving campaign contributions or controlling them. So Norm is working for a foreign government and foreign individuals, clearly, the Saudi royal family to be specific. And he is, saying, well, but that's just one side of what I do. I have this other, I guess, unrelated side, in which I am very active with working with the campaign process. As a matter of fact, he is probably one of the most important fundraisers for the Republican Party. And he proved that in 2018 when he was the man who made the $30 million ask of Sheldon Adelson to come in big for those midterms. So this guy is clearly a very influential and important figure in Republican Party fundraising. And yeah, he is then his other day job, as it were, is lobbying the people who he helps to get elected in many cases on behalf of his foreign client.
Now, the American Action Network, let's overlay some of this into this discussion because it's important for people to understand. Again, Saudi Arabian lobbyist for the Saudi Arabian government is running two major spenders in the election, or at least has leadership roles in these two major spenders in the election. One of the spenders, the American Action Network, we've been talking about the Congressional Leadership Fund and how it supports Republican candidates for Congress. The American Action Network is a dark money group. Point being, we actually don't know where it gets its money at all. It doesn't have to disclose that. So now put that into the context of a guy who's running it is lobbying for the Saudi government. He's running a dark money organization, and we don't know where that money comes from. Is that basically right?
Yeah. So the essence of this, and I want to be clear here, this isn't a structure that Norm Coleman came up with, but sure, this is a very common structure. And I would dare say this is probably one of the largest examples of how it gets used to move dark money into the American election system. So the gist of it is you got to have two pieces to make this dark money formula, as it were, come together. And the first piece you need is the super PAC. The super PAC in this case is the Congressional Leadership Fund. There's a lot of other ones out there. But Congressional Leadership Fund in this case is the super PAC that he's involved with. Now, super PACs can raise unlimited sums of money. They can also largely spend unlimited sums, although they cannot give the money directly to candidates. So they have to spend in so-called outside spend in the races. But they can run commercials. They can do all sorts of election activities that may be beneficial or harmful to a candidate. So that's the Congressional Leadership Fund. Now, super PACs do have to disclose where their money comes from. So they have to register with the FEC, and they show, each one of the contributions that comes in. Now, here's where things get kind of tricky or beautiful if you're trying to hide money coming into the American election system, which is that you have an affiliated 501c4, which is a type of nonprofit group, and it is not registered as an electioneering organization that has to disclose the source of its funds to the FEC. And this American Action Network pretty much exists to shovel money into the Congressional Leadership Fund. And each one of those contributions shows up. Congressional Leadership Fund has to show every one of the $1 million or $500,000 contributions that come in like clockwork from American Action Network, usually multiple times per month. But where that money came from for American Action Network, that is totally concealed. Nobody knows where that money comes from.
Okay, so to be clear, when the Congressional Leadership Fund discloses this, all they're disclosing in their line is contribution from the American Action Network, but we don't actually know where that money comes from. Okay, so now let's zoom out here. Everyone's now heard, okay, so we got a Saudi lobbyist, former Republican senator, running these two major spenders in the election, one of them being a dark money group where we don't even know where the money comes from. So I would ask you, what's the problem with this? What are the potential conflicts here? What are the potential nefarious parts of this that make it problematic in your viewpoint?
Well, the problem that I see here, assuming that Norm Coleman is telling us the truth, which we will assume, or not Norm Coleman, but American Action Network and Congressional Leadership Fund that are adamant that there are no foreign contributors to these organizations, is that this presents an enormous conflict of interest. That Norm Coleman is regularly emailing members of Congress. And I've seen these emails, and he writes a lot of them. And these are disclosed under the Foreign Agent Registration Act. And he wrote over 1,000 emails to House and Senate staffers in 2021 and 2022 thus far alone. So he is just hammering members of Congress, mostly Republicans, if not entirely Republicans, with messaging about Saudi Arabia. Now, there's no way these people don't know that he is also one of the most prominent fundraisers for members of Congress, the Congressional Leadership Fund, and that they rely on this money. It's incredibly important to them. So when he writes emails, for instance, he's written repeatedly about the war in Yemen, trying to usually portray the Saudis as not responsible for the 370,000 some deaths that have occurred in that war, suggesting that the Saudis are the ones trying to make peace with the Houthi rebels, and it's the Houthis that are the only impediment to there being an end to the violence in Yemen and to the humanitarian crisis and the food shortages and the famine. That's the type of thing that he's regularly sending emails, and those have to be disclosed. So you see the Republican Party's one of their biggest fundraisers, and the way that this person is making contact with members of Congress who are dependent on him, and the way that he's making contact and the topic that he's talking to them about seems to at least largely be represented by the interests of Saudi Arabia.
Right. So this is not, to be clear, this is not some constituent, sending an email to their congressperson. The clear problem with this is that you've got a guy who comes to Republican members of Congress essentially as their bankroller, as one of their money guys, also saying, I want you to do X, I want you to do Y for my client, the Saudi monarchy. Point being that the members of Congress presumably are more willing to listen to, if not follow the direction of Norm Coleman, knowing that his requests come or that he is making these requests and simultaneously serving as the guy who is directing a massive amount of money into potentially their runs for reelection, their future Senate races, if they want to run, for another office, et cetera, et cetera. It's that the money, the nexus of him lobbying for a foreign government while also being this major money guy enhances potentially in a almost unique kind of way his ability to influence members of Congress way beyond, by the way, what even a regular lobbyist would be able to influence, much less just a constituent. That seems to me to be the problem. Now, I want to go because you mentioned it, but I want to go a little deeper on this. Give us, if you can, a little more of a picture of the other kinds of things that he's lobbying for. Like, what does the Saudi government want out of the U.S. Congress? What does the Saudi government want Norm Coleman to secure for them through his relationships in Congress?
Well, the interesting thing is that a lot of his focus in terms of actual outreach to members of Congress has been around Yemen. But Yemen, you got to start to pull that apart about what does this really mean to the Saudis? And a lot of this has to do with maintaining at least the perception with members of Congress that the Saudis are responsible actors, that they are actors that are not responsible for humanitarian disasters. And why is that? Well, there's a few reasons. A big one is that none of certainly the war in Yemen, or a lot of their other interests in terms of their own national security or their perceived security interests, can be achieved without American weapons. And that other little quiet part about it, which is American contractors. They need to be able to keep those contracts flowing. They need to make sure that Congress continues to permit those contracts to move forward, because these are all things that can be turned on or off. And right now we're seeing, for instance, a huge backlash against the Saudis because of, the OPEC cuts, which are, perceived as being the Saudis trying to put their thumbs on the scale to benefit the Republicans in the midterms. But they need that influence in order to really maintain a lot of the things that are incredibly important to them. Now, these aren't necessarily, for instance, Saudi Arabia's access to American weapons, Saudi Arabia's ability to project their power into Yemen, Saudi Arabia's ability to even maintain the control over their own people that the Saudi royal family and the House of Saud value. None of these are necessarily totally synonymous with American interests. It's a separate country. Now, that's putting aside, what issues you may have with Saudi Arabia and the Saudi royal family. This is a country on the other side of the world. Their interests are not aligned with the United States all the time. They shouldn't be. That's okay. But people like Norm Coleman and the $21 million a year lobbying operation that the Saudis run in Washington do really try hard to try to cloud that and to suggest that really the Saudis are just an extension of American interests in the Middle East.
That's a really important point, and I'm glad you brought up how important this is right now. I mean, you're right. There is a situation now where you've got, for instance, Congressman Ro Khanna talking about what can be done to push back on Saudi arms sales, with the Saudis doing OPEC cuts, potentially inflating the cost of gasoline right before the election. So the Saudi congressional relationship is always somewhat fraught, always somewhat precarious. Certainly, it should be after the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. Certainly, it should be based on what the Saudis' larger human rights record and the like. So it's very important to underscore that they want a very, very powerful lobbyist and lobbying team, headed in part by Norm Coleman, preserving that relationship. It is very lucrative to that country. So my final question for you, Eli, then, is if we accept that this kind of melding of political spending with Norm Coleman running these groups, including a dark money group in the election, while also wearing the hat as a lobbyist for a foreign government, if we accept that that is problematic and that Norm Coleman is a kind of shining example of a larger problem, is there anything being done in Congress to stop people like Norm Coleman from wielding this kind of outsized influence on behalf of a foreign government? And if there's not something happening already, what are the kinds of things that could be done?
Well, I think we are, for a variety of reasons, at least I hope, not because it's to my hobby horse, but I actually do think we are at an inflection point in there being some mobilization by Congress around foreign influence in a variety of ways that I actually think is really important to address. And I think the best example of this is the Fighting Foreign Influence Act that was introduced by Representatives Jared Golden, Katie Porter, and Paul Gosar. So it's a bipartisan piece of legislation, and it actually attacks the issue in I think three really important, perhaps equally interesting and valuable ways. And the way that would actually limit at least future Norm Colemans of the world from doing what they do is that it would ban former senior U.S. military officers, senior executive branch officials, and members of Congress from ever lobbying for a foreign principal. Essentially, they couldn't register under the Foreign Agents Registration Act. So basically, Norm Coleman, who's on that $175,000 a month contract for Saudi Arabia, just couldn't do so anymore. That would be it. Now, he would be able to continue to do it, but the future Norm Colemans presumably would not be able to. But there's a couple other really interesting aspects of this legislation that I think are perhaps even more meaningful. I think a big one would require tax-exempt organizations, which would include think tanks, and that's really who it's targeting, to disclose any large gifts from foreign governments or foreign political parties. And I think that would be incredibly important. And one of the other areas that I have a real point of concern with is I think we have effectively a dark money machine going on in Washington, D.C. Around influencing foreign policy. And a lot of that runs through not just lobbyists who have to disclose. And in defense to Norm Coleman, he is a registered agent of Saudi Arabia under the Foreign Agent Registration Act, and good for him for registering. A lot of people don't. And a lot of think tanks take foreign funding, don't disclose it on their websites. They certainly don't register under the Foreign Agent Registration Act. They believe they do not need to. And that money is effectively invisible. We never get to see it, but it's funding the research and the work of people who are testifying before Congress, who are writing op-eds in newspapers, and who are producing the research that ultimately hopes to inform U.S. policy. The final and third one is pretty simple component of this legislation, which is it would require political campaigns to verify that people making online contributions, probably via a credit card, can show that there's a U.S. address tied to the card. That it seems pretty reasonable to me.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad that you reported this story, because it really does shine a spotlight on a part of the campaign finance system and the foreign government influence system that we don't really usually get to see. So congratulations on such a great article. Really great work on this reporting. Eli Clifton is a senior advisor at the Quincy Institute and an investigative journalist at large at Responsible Statecraft. You can find him on Twitter at Eli Clifton. Eli, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you so much, David.